Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Today is August 15th, 2009. Good morning, everybody. Okay, now we are coming to the last chapter in this book. But before we enter into the last chapter itself, I just want to do a short review of what we've covered, starting from chapter 7. Okay, in chapter 7 we did a broad overview of the path, taking both the Noble Eightfold Path and then the graduated training, the step-by-step training. Then in chapter 8 I focused more intensively on what I call the mastery of the mind. This is especially the training in developing serenity or samadhi and insight or panya, the method for doing this. And so we saw that the text speaks sometimes about alternative routes that a practitioner can take. Some routes prescribe the development of samatha first, followed by insight or vipassana. Another route prescribes the development of insight first, followed by samatha or samadhi. But the usual step-by-step graduated training of the Buddha places the training in samadhi, in concentration, before the development of insight or wisdom, because the concentrated mind is the basis for developing insight. Okay, so we move through a number of sections that deal with the removal of distracting thoughts, overcoming the 5 hindrances. And then we went into the main discourse of the Buddha dealing with meditation practice. This is the Satipatthana Sutta, the practice or the development of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And the practice of Satipatthana leads to the development of both serenity or samadhi and insight. Then, out of the Satipatthana Sutta, one particular meditation subject was given particular emphasis by the Buddha. This is mindfulness of breathing. And so we took a short sutta which describes the stages in practicing mindfulness of breathing. And the practice of samadhi meditation culminates in the achievement of 4 stages of meditative absorption. These are called the 4 jhanas. And then beyond that, there are 4 higher stages of serenity called the 4 formless attainments, the arupa samapatti. And beyond the formless attainment, there's a special state called the cessation of perception and feeling. And so in the last selection in this chapter on mastering the mind, we saw how Venerable Sariputta has mastered all of these stages of samadhi meditation. But the practice of the formless meditation and even the attainment of cessation of perception and feeling, these are not necessary for the attainment of the final goal, even the attainment of arhatship. But most suttas just speak about the practice of the 4 jhanas. Okay, then chapter 9 is called Shining the Light of Wisdom. And in this chapter we focus on the particular subject matter that has to be investigated in order to develop wisdom. In chapter 8 we just dealt with the techniques that lead to the development of insight, but not so much with the, what I might call the domain or subject matter of insight wisdom. But in chapter 9, we focus much more extensively, examine much more extensively what are the types of topics or subjects or principles that have to be investigated and penetrated with wisdom. And so one sutta that gives us a broad overview of these topics to be investigated with wisdom is the Samadhi Sutta, the Discourse on Right View. And we saw that the principles that are to be understood even before one properly develops wisdom include the law of karma and its fruits, that includes the distinction between the wholesome and the unwholesome, the 4 nutriments of life, the 4 noble truths, and dependent origination. And moving further into suttas that deal with the actual practice in developing wisdom, I broke these down according to the particular objective sphere with which they are concerned. And so we can see that wisdom is developed by investigating the 5 aggregates, or sometimes the 6 sense bases, or sometimes the 18 elements, 4 elements, or 6 elements. And even though these domains of investigation are different, there's a certain intersection between them, so that they are not really dealing with a different object, but these are just different perspectives on the nature of experience, different ways in which we can investigate our own experience. Each one has its own point of emphasis. The 5 aggregates is the broadest dissection of human experience into 5 categories of the physical aspect, which is called form. Then the mental aspect has the 4 other aggregates, the aspect of feeling, perception, volition, and then the whole awareness of the experience, which is consciousness. The teaching on the 6 sense bases deals with how consciousness arises based upon objects and sense faculties. And the teaching on the elements gives more attention generally to the material side of existence. Since we have here 4 elements, the 4 material elements, or the 6 elements. But even though there's a difference in the 5 aggregates, 6 sense bases, and the different elements, but what underlies them all are certain principles, common principles or frameworks, in terms of which these objects are to be investigated. And so one prominent framework is that of the 3 characteristics of existence, that they are impermanent, bound up with some degree of dissatisfaction or suffering, and that they are devoid of any kind of substantial self, they're non-self. Another pattern is that of the 4 noble truths. One has to understand what the phenomena is, one has to understand how it originates, its cause or causes, how it ceases, and the practical means to bring about its cessation. So another pattern is what I call the gratification triad. That is understanding the phenomena in terms of its enjoyment, the gratification that it brings, in terms of the danger, its drawbacks or defects, and in terms of the escape, the way to release from the danger. Okay, so then these phenomena, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 18 or 6 elements, all of these are in a way elaborations of the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Then, with wisdom, one has to investigate dependent origination to understand how this suffering originates. So the teaching of dependent origination is actually an expansion of the second noble truth. And so the 12-fold formula, the 12-factored formula of dependent origination teaches us, reveals to us what I call the causal dynamism, the causal dynamics at the base of the round of birth and death. What is the network of causes and conditions that keep the wheel of samsara turning from life to life? And then when we investigate dependent origination, we also see what we have to do to bring an end to suffering. And that is, we have to eliminate clinging and craving. And to eliminate clinging and craving, one must trace them to their deepest root. And that deepest root is avidya, ignorance. Okay, then lastly, we took as under this heading of the development, the domain of wisdom, the teaching of the Buddha, which sums up his teaching most comprehensively, and that is the Four Noble Truths. And we saw different ways in which the Buddha presents the Four Noble Truths, and most importantly, I emphasize that the Four Noble Truths are not just a theoretical doctrine, but they impose 4 tasks that we have to perform, 4 functions that we have to master with regard to each Noble Truth. The Noble Truth of dukkha or suffering has to be parinyeya. It has to be fully understood. The Noble Truth of the cause of suffering, which is craving, has to be eliminated or abandoned. Pahatava. The noble truth of the cessation of suffering has to be penetrated and realized. Satchitatthava. And the noble truth of the path, the way to the ending of suffering, has to be developed, practiced, and developed. Bhavitava. And so one who reaches the final goal of the Buddha's teaching says, what had to be done has been done. Kaccang karaniyam, kaccang karaniyam. And so what is it that this person has done that had to be done? This person has fully understood the truth of suffering, fully eliminated the causes of suffering, fully realized the cessation of suffering, and completely practiced the Noble Eightfold Path to the end of suffering. Okay, then in the last section of this chapter, we investigated the goal of wisdom. This is what is called Nibana. And we saw that Nibana is described from different points of view. And so we have different, in the text we meet different descriptions of Nibbana. I said that we meet a description in terms of the task to be achieved to realize Nibbana. And so in this respect, Nibbana might be described as the destruction of greed, destruction of hatred, destruction of delusion, as the elimination of craving, the ending of clinging, virāga, dispassion, and so on. We also meet descriptions of Nibbana in terms of the way it's experienced by the person who has attained it. So Nibbana is described as the Paramasukha, the supreme happiness, as muti, deliverance or liberation, as shanti, peace, as anuttara yoga kema, the supreme security from bondage, dukkha nirodha, the extinction of suffering. Okay, another description, another method of description is what I called a metaphysical or philosophical description. So we find Nibbana described as the unborn, unconditioned, unproduced, unoriginated. Usually it's when the philosophical approach is taken, Nibbana is described as the negation of things within our ordinary experience. Because everything within our ordinary experience is conditioned, produced, originated, brought about through the collaboration of different conditions. And Nibbana, as the opposite of this, can only be described as that which is not conditioned, not produced, not brought about through the collaboration of conditions, and so on. And then finally we have a kind of metaphorical description of Nibbana, using aspects from ordinary experience that are attractive, appealing, uplifting, to convey the nature of the final goal. So Nibbana is called the island. In a country with tumultuous rivers, with frequent floods, the island is a symbol of safety and security. It's called the refuge, sarana. It's called the harbor. When the ship is riding on the ocean, it comes into security in the harbor. It's called the final destination. Also it's called the cool state, because it's the release from the heat of the passions and defilements. Okay, so now, having come through this review, we come to the final chapter, chapter 10, which is called the planes or stages of realization. Okay, this chapter is especially important because we have to realize that the distinction between a person who is completely unenlightened and a person who is fully enlightened is not a simple black and white distinction. But there are stages along the way to the attainment of Nibbana. So when the Buddha himself went out on his quest for enlightenment, from the description of the texts that have come down to us, it seemed that the Buddha reached the stage of full and final enlightenment all in one sitting on one night. But we see that when the Buddha began to teach, when he taught his first 5 disciples, when he gave his first discourse on the Four Noble Truths, at the end of that discourse, we read that there arose in one of the monks, his name was Anyakandanyo, there arose in him the stainless, dust-free eye of Dhamma, the eye or the vision of the truth. And then as the Buddha continued to teach the other monks, they also gained this eye of Dhamma, stainless, dust-free eye of Dhamma. Now, if we just read the text superficially, we might think this means they became enlightened, that they reached the same goal as the Buddha did. But actually, when one continues to read the text, one sees that after these monks had gained the eye of Dhamma, the Buddha continued to teach them, and it was only after the Buddha taught them a later discourse, maybe a few days later, I think it's 5 days later, the Buddha taught them the discourse on non-self, and then their minds became completely freed from the defilements. So already this implies that when they gained the eye of Dhamma, they weren't yet fully enlightened, fully liberated. So this is implying that there's a sequence of stages that one goes through in order to achieve the final goal. And so as time went on, these stages became differentiated into 4 major stages, which are, we call them the 4 stages of awakening. And then as we investigate the text further, we see that each of these 4 major stages can be distinguished into 2 subordinate phases. These 2 phases mark a distinction between what is called technically path and fruition. And so this gives us 4 major stages each one divided into 2, so we get 8 types of noble persons, 8 persons who are in some way embodiments or realizers of the Dhamma. So these 2 major stages, I said 2, these 4 major stages Okay, so these are the 4 main stages. The stage of what's called the stream enterer, Sotapanna. The stream is the stream of the Dhamma, which is, in this case, it's explained as the Noble Eightfold Path. And one who has entered the stream means that this person is now flowing along with the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is carrying that person all the ways to the attainment of liberation. So before reaching the stage of Sotapanna, the person has to strive and struggle practicing the Noble Eightfold Path to the best of his ability. When all of the qualities of the path mature, some change takes place so that that person falls into the stream, you could say, and then the stream will carry that person along. Of course, it doesn't mean that the person doesn't have to practice. The person still has to practice, but now the practice becomes completely natural, completely integrated into the being or personhood of that person. Okay, the next stage is called the once returner. I'll explain a little bit later the exact meaning of these terms. Then comes the non-returner, anagami, one who doesn't return to this world in which we live, but is not yet free from the cycle of rebirth. And then finally comes the arahant, the one who has broken through all of the bonds, cut off all of the fetters, and become fully liberated while alive. Then each of these main stages, as I said, is subdivided into two. There is one on the way to attaining the stage of a stream enterer. Technically, this is called one who is practicing for the attainment of the fruit. One practicing to realize the fruit. And then the second phase is one who has attained the fruit, one who has actually realized the fruit, one who has become the stream enterer. Okay, so when we take these 8 stages together, then we get 8 types of persons. And these persons are designated by a special word in the Buddha's teaching. It's a word which has gotten a bad reputation. But they are called Aryans, which means noble ones. So these 8 are called the 8 noble persons. The word Aryan, originally in India, it meant noble one. It was used by those of the higher caste with reference to themselves. But the Buddha took this word over and gave it a new interpretation. For him, nobility was not constituted by birth, by lineage, by color of skin, but by way of one's spiritual qualities. So those who would embody the spiritual qualities of a lofty person, one who is upright, wise, diligent, particularly one who has realized any of these stages of awakening, becomes a noble person. And the noble ones are distinguished from all other people who are called Putujanas. The word Putujana means an ordinary person or a common person. And so the common person is one who has not realized any of these stages of awakening. But there are many types of putujanas, and they're usually distinguished into two main types. One it's called the uninstructed or untaught worldling. The uninstructed, ordinary person. And this is a person who doesn't have any respect for the noble ones, who doesn't have any knowledge of the noble teaching, who doesn't train or practice in the noble teaching. And this is contrasted with what is called sometimes the virtuous worldling, the good worldling, the wise worldling. This is a person who is still not yet reached any stage of awakening, but has trust in the noble Dhamma, is trying to understand the Dhamma, and is trying to practice the Dhamma. Okay, we see the 8 types of noble persons are enumerated in the first selection of this chapter. This is on page 385. Here the text says, "These 8 persons are worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of offerings, worthy of reverential salutations, the unsurpassed field of merit for the world." What 8? The stream enterer, the one practicing for the realization of the fruit of stream entry, and so on, the once returner, non-returner, the arahant, and the one practicing for arahatship. Okay, so those are the 8 types of noble persons. And these 8 are distinguished into 2 broad categories. I hope all of these categories are not making you dizzy. Anybody getting dizzy? Okay, the first 7 from the one who has entered upon the path to the attainment of stream entry, up through the one who has entered on the path to arahatship, these are called sakas. And the word saka means one in training. A trainee. They're called trainees because they have to undertake the training, practice the training of the Noble Eightfold Path, or the training in morality, meditation, and wisdom. Then the arahant, in contrast, is called useka, which literally means non-training, one who isn't training. But when the arhat is said to be a non-trainer, it doesn't mean that he doesn't undertake any practice. But the intention is really one who has finished the training, one who has completed the training. Okay, now what distinguishes one type or one grade of noble disciple from another is the strength of their spiritual faculties. And so the Buddha speaks of 5 spiritual faculties. These are faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. We can see a certain sequence in these spiritual faculties. First, presupposes that one has faith, not as blind belief, but trust in the Buddha, and trust in the Dhamma, in order to take up the practice or the training. When one takes up the training, then one applies energy, and one applies that energy to the development of mindfulness. And then when energy and mindfulness work together, they bring deepening concentration or samadhi. And then based on samadhi, one develops panya, wisdom. Okay, so the different types of noble disciples are graded according to the strength of their faculties. And so in this text, this is still on page 385, one who has completed and fulfilled these 5 faculties is an arahant. If the faculties are weaker, then one is practicing for the realization of the fruit of arahantship. If they are still weaker, one is a non-returner, and then by descending grades, practicing for the fruit of non-returning, a once-returner, practicing for the fruit of once-returning, a stream enterer, and then one practicing for the realization of the fruit of stream entry. And then one in whom these 5 faculties are completely and totally absent is an outsider, one who is standing amidst the worldlings. Okay, but I would say that a virtuous worldling is one who is, to some extent, who has faith in the Buddha Dhamma and is practicing, has the 5 faculties, but the 5 faculties are still on the weak side. They're not yet strong enough to bring one over this gap between the ordinary people and the Aryans. But when the faculties gain a particular degree of strength, then one crosses that gap and becomes a noble one. Okay, now I want to explain in more detail how these, especially the 4 main types of noble disciples, how they are distinguished, how they're differentiated. And for this, the text on page 386, selection 3, is helpful. Okay, so here the Buddha says, monks, the Dhamma well expounded by me thus is clear, open, evident, free of patchwork. In this Dhamma, and so on. Those monks who are arahants with taints destroyed, think maybe it's better that I start at the bottom and work up. But I'm going to start on paragraph 45. Okay, the Dhamma well expounded by me thus is clear, free of patchwork, and the Dhamma well expounded by me thus. Those monks who have abandoned 3 fetters are all stream enterers, no longer bound to the lower world, fixed in destiny, with enlightenment as their destination. Okay, this passage is going to show us that there are 2 criteria that distinguish the different grades of the noble disciples. One criterion is the particular defilement that they eliminate. The second criterion is the number of rebirths that they have remaining and where their rebirth will take place. The defilements that are eliminated are usually enumerated by way of 10, what are called the 10 fetters. The word fetter, sanyojana, it means a bond, something which ties one down. And so the one who becomes a stream enterer has abandoned 3 fetters, the first 3 fetters. And what are these 3 fetters? Okay, the first of these is the view of a truly existing self in regard to the 5 aggregates. This is called, going to need 2 boards. Maybe I can erase this. Okay, the first is called Sakkaya Ditthi, which is rather hard to translate very literally, but we can understand it, as I said, it's the view of a self existing among the 5 aggregates, either identical with them or standing in some relation to them. And so the person who becomes a stream enterer completely eliminates every vestige of this view of a real self. Okay, the second fetter that's eliminated is called the Fetter of Doubt. This is doubt about the Buddha and about his teachings. And so because the stream enterer has seen the truth of the Dhamma, and so he has no doubt that the Dhamma is true, because it's now just the way I can see this pen in my hand. So the stream enterer has seen the truth, and so has no doubt that the Dhamma expresses the truth, and has no doubt that the Buddha is an enlightened one who is fully realized and teaches this truth. And then the third fetter is called Sila Bhatta Paramasa, which means literally the wrong grasp of rules and observances. Sometimes it's translated clinging to rites and rituals, but I don't actually see that meaning in the original Pali words. But sila usually means rules, sometimes precepts, and bhatta means other types of observances. And this is explained by the commentaries to mean clinging to the certain rules and observances that were undertaken by the ascetics in India in the Buddha's time, particularly those that involved tormenting the body, self-mortification, behaving sometimes like an animal, standing on one leg, sleeping on beds of thorns, reducing one's intake of food until one will be fasting for long periods, exposing one's body to the heat of the sun, going out naked during the cold season in order to experience the bitter cold. So all of these practices that were undertaken by the ascetics in the belief that they can lead to liberation, these are called sila-bhatta, rules and observances, and grasping them wrongly, that is the fetter. So this doesn't mean that the follower of the Buddha's teaching doesn't follow rules, doesn't undertake observances, but he doesn't undertake any of these whole outside way observances, these practices and observances that are contrary to the principles of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, so the stream enterer has eliminated these three fetters, and it said that this one is no longer bound to the lower world. This means that the stream enterer can no longer take rebirth in any of the lower realms of existence, the hell realm, the animal realm, or the realm of the tormented spirits or hungry ghosts. They're fixed in destiny, which means that they're bound to reach the final goal, and they have some bodhi, enlightenment, as their destination. They definitely will reach enlightenment. When will they reach the final goal? This text itself doesn't tell us, but other texts say that they have at most 7 more rebirths. It might be fewer rebirths if they practice diligently. They can reach the final goal and even 1 more rebirth, 2 more, 3 more rebirths, but at most 7 more rebirths. And those rebirths will take place either in the human realm or in the celestial realm, the heavenly realm. They'll never be reborn in any of the lower realms. Okay, then I move up to paragraph 44. In the Dhamma, well expounded by me thus, those monks who have abandoned 3 fetters and attenuated, that means weakened or reduced, lust, hate, and delusion, are all once returners, returning once to this world to make an end of suffering. Okay, from this we see that the once returner doesn't eradicate any new fetters. This one eradicates the same 3 fetters that the stream enterer does. But also, he reduces the 3 root defilements, lust, hatred, and delusion, to such an extent that he will come back to this world only 1 more time and then reach the final goal. But actually the commentary explains that one at this level might be reborn again in the human world and then reach the final goal in the next human rebirth, or he might be reborn in the heavenly world, and reach the final goal there, or he might be reborn in the heavenly world one time and then come back to the human world and then reach the final goal in this world. So there are several routes that the once returner can take. Okay, if one practices and develops further, then one can reach the third stage of realization. This is the stage of the non-returner. The non-returner is one who has eliminated the 5 lower fetters. That is the same 3 that the stream enterer eliminates, and 2 more. Okay, so the non-returner eliminates 2 new fetters that the stream enterer and once returner haven't eliminated. These 2 are sensual desire, sensual craving, sensual lust, and ill will, anger, or hatred. And so the stream enterer is completely free from the attraction of sense pleasures, completely free from any kind of irritation, anger, or ill will. And these 5 fetters are called the lower fetters because these 5 fetters bind us to the desire realm of existence. The human world, the sensually delightful heavenly realm, and the lower realms. And so the non-returner has eliminated these 5 lower fetters, and therefore the non-returner never comes back to the human world, never takes a rebirth, even in the sensual heavens, the heavens where sensual delight still exists. But the non-returner will be reborn spontaneously. That means without parents, they re-arise. Well, I don't have personal experience of it. I can't give too vivid a description. But they are reborn in some higher realm, just I guess it's like you see the cartoons sometimes, that being suddenly appears out of thin air. So just they arise suddenly, spontaneously. But where do they arise? They arise in special higher realms, which are in the realm of form. This is the realm of existence in which there's still physical form, still matter, but there's no longer any kind of sensual desire in that realm. And there is said to be a particular part of the form realm which is reserved for the non-returners. This part is called the pure abode. And so most of the non-returners are reborn in these pure abodes. And they live in these pure abodes, and then they achieve final liberation there without ever coming back to this world. But even the non-returner still has 5 fetters remaining. These are called the 5 higher fetters. Okay, so one is called craving for form. And this is still a very subtle type of craving. It's not like the coarse craving that an ordinary person has, but there's some kind of attachment to the meditative attainments of the jhanas and some craving to go on existing in the form realm. And then a little more subtle than that is the next fetter, which is the craving for the formless. This is a kind of attachment to the formless meditation, states of meditation, and even a craving to experience the formless realms of existence. The eighth fetter is conceit, which doesn't mean, it's not the gross type of conceit that ordinary people have, but this is a very subtle, remaining sense of I am, that there's some kind of I present. It's different from the view of self. It's not an actual philosophical view or doctrinal view that there is a real self, but it's just a subtle distortion in the mind which makes their experience seem to converge upon an I at the core of their experience. The ninth is called restlessness. Again, it's not the kind of restlessness that we experience when we can't make our mind get still and quiet, because the non-returner is somebody who has usually mastered the jhanas, and so they can easily gain some state of samadhi, but there's still a little bit of some kind of very subtle rippling in the mind from time to time. Maybe it's like a pool of water, which is usually very still, but occasionally a light breeze will come and blow across the surface of the water and cause very light wavelets to arise on the water. Our mind's usually like the ocean when a typhoon is stirring up. And then the 10th fetter, the most fundamental of all, is ignorance. It doesn't mean that the non-returner hasn't understood the essence of the Dhamma, but there's still some degree of ignorance left. I sometimes think of it this way. For the ordinary person, the mind might be covered 100% by ignorance. Maybe that's a little strong, but okay. Just think of it that way, just for the purpose of the simile. I don't want to offend anybody. But I have a PhD. I've read so many books. How can you say I'm ignorant? Okay, but just think, maybe we'll think of the ordinary person, the mind is like the moon on the night of the dark moon, completely dark. Well, not completely dark. Even on the night of the dark moon, one could still see some light. So we can't say that the moon is completely dark. You could still see the moon in the sky, right? So that will be the knowledge or wisdom that the ordinary person has. Then we could think the stream enterer is like the person on the night of the quarter moon, when there's 1/4 of wisdom or understanding, 3/4 left of ignorance. The once returner is like the person on the night of the once returner is like the moon on the night of the half moon. The once returner is a person like the half moon. So the half moon, half dark, half bright. So the once returner has half wisdom, half ignorance. The non-returner is like the moon on the night when 3/4 of the moon is bright, 1/4 is dark. And the Arahant is like the moon on the full night, completely bright. Okay, so those are the 5 higher fetters that remain in the non-returner. Then the Arahant is one who has completely destroyed all of the fetters. And so then in paragraph 42 we have the Arahant destroyed as those monks who are Arahants with taints destroyed, the taints of the asavas, the inflows, who have lived the spiritual life, they've completed the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. They've utterly destroyed all of the fetters that bind one to existence, all 10 of them, and they are completely liberated through final knowledge. And for them it says there is no round for manifestation, which means that they don't come back to rebirth in any of the realms of existence. Okay, maybe at this point I'll stop and then ask whether there's any questions. Any questions? Yep.
I'm just curious, as far as Zen and today, these Theravada with you, is it similar? I think I see differences, but they're coming from the body of ancient texts.
Yeah.
Yet they interpret it differently, or how does that?
Yeah. First, the teaching about the different stages of enlightenment, the fetters and so on. It's not, let us say, it's not distinctively, maybe now we call it Theravada, but this is coming from the early period Buddhism, even before the different schools emerged. So these were teachings which would have been common to all of the schools of early Buddhism. So the Theravada is the only school of early Buddhism which has survived into the modern times. But this teaching about the 4 stages, 10 fetters, what realms of rebirth lie ahead for them, these would have been shared by the Theravada, Sarvastivada, Dharma-guptaka, Mahasangika, Mahimsaka, Samatya. There were many, proverbially there were 18 schools of early Buddhism, and they would have all shared this particular scheme. Okay, even now Indian Mahayana Buddhism recognizes this scheme. For example, one finds it meant the 4 types of persons mentioned in the famous Diamond Sutra. So So one does find that Indian Mahayana Buddhism acknowledged the scheme of the 4 stages of noble persons. But then as Mahayana Buddhism developed, since the Mahayana takes the Bodhisattva ideal as its sort of governing idea, eventually it developed a theory or a system of 10 stages of a Bodhisattva's development or evolution towards Buddhahood. And then it tried to match the 10 stages or line them up against the early scheme of the 4 stages. And so this was a scheme basic to Indian Mahayana Buddhism. Now, when Buddhism came to China, it developed its own schools like Zen. And then maybe the Zen masters who would have read the early texts would have been familiar with this scheme, but maybe many of them didn't read them. And so this scheme didn't come into Zen, or it doesn't figure prominently in Zen Buddhism. But Zen, I think, developed its own scheme. Different schools of Zen developed their own scheme of stages. And then Tibetan Buddhism, again, those who are familiar with the Indian Buddhist teachings would know the system of the 4 stages. But the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, according to their own practices and conception of realization, developed its own scheme of stages of realization.
Is the kind of better listeners the same as that one in 5 sentences?
The Pali word,
or is it just different in degree?
the Pali word is the same, so technically it's referring to the same particular mental factor or mental quality, but I think the degree would be significantly different. The restlessness, that's the obstruction or hindrance to the jhanas, is a coarser type of restlessness. Whereas this would be something very subtle which just arises occasionally. Did you have a question? Okay, please take it.
If a person is on the path to serenity,
Yeah.
and if a person dies before attaining serenity,
Yeah.
in the next birth, the person has to start from the ground level, or whether the wisdom gained in the past will be restored as in consciousness?
Okay, this is an interesting question, because it's said in another sutta, I think we will come to it later, that when a person reaches the stage of the past stream entry, that is when they're one practicing for realizing the fruit of stream entry, they cannot die without having realized the fruit of stream entry. So they have to achieve stream entry in the same life in which they enter the path. They won't die before reaching the fruit. And then once a person becomes a stream enterer and then comes back to the human world, then they come back as a stream enterer, so they don't have to start over again in order to achieve stream entry again. Okay, Suki had a question.
I have a question about one returner and non-returner being reborn in heavenly world.
Yeah.
And then from there they reach final goal. What kind of practice are they able to do in heavenly world? With what kind of faculty? And how that and also in what heavenly world are they reborn? That's my question.
For the once returner and the non-returner.
Once returner, they will be reborn in heavenly.
Yeah.
Either human world is okay. I mean, we understand what we have to do. But when they are reborn in heavenly world, because some time ago we were taught that only in human world and in pure abode it's possible to practice and then reach the goal. But in other heavenly worlds, if you're reborn, what's the state that it makes the person who could practice there?
Let me make a phone call.
Supporting kind of a commentary or...
Hello, Ravindra. Are you up there? Okay, I don't have the divine eye, so I don't have first-hand knowledge of what's going on up in the heavenly world. But I suppose that this mind that we often hear, it's only in the human world that you can make any kind of progress, is a bit of an exaggeration. I think what is true is that what is said is that a Buddha can arise only in the human world. But those who reach some level of attainment as human beings and then take rebirth in the heavenly world will be able to go on and continue with their practice under very suitable conditions that will be conducive to the advancement of their practice. Now, for an ordinary person who gets reborn in the heavenly world, there is said to be the danger that there are a lot of sensual delights in the heavenly world. And so such a person could easily be seduced by those heavenly delights, sometimes literally seduced, sometimes just through the working of his own mind, get carried away by the heavenly delights, and then lose track of whatever understanding he's developed as a human being, and then just indulge in the heavenly sense pleasures. But those who have become Aryan disciples, or Aryan persons, stream enterer, once returner, even the once returner, stream enterer, once returner, even if they're reborn in the sensual heavenly realm, they have very clear right view, right understanding. And because of their right view, they won't be carried away by the craving for sensual enjoyment or the other delights of the heaven, but they're able to carry on their practice until they either make some progress or even reach the final goal there.
Is it in sensual heavenly world, or is it possible in formless heavenly world that one can actually practice also?
No, even in the sensual heavenly realm, they're able to practice and to make progress. I think it's just pretty much analogous to the human realm. Like here we have now, so many sensually enticing types of entertainment, shows, dancing, music, delightful cuisines of different kinds. French, Spanish cooking, Chinese cooking, Thai restaurants. And yet if one is really earnest and diligent in one's practice, one will go to Leo's Chinese restaurant. If one is really earnest and is diligent in one's practice, one won't be sidetracked by these sensual delights. And so I think it will be the same in the heavenly world. Correct?
I don't like the microphone.
Okay.
If you live your life as a person of good conduct and you have a peaceful death,
Yeah.
do you suppose things will become aware to you at that time that you weren't aware before, but you were on the path to? Say you be an arahant or
I didn't catch the last.
an arahant or a true measure. In other words, the time of your death, in other words, you're a person of good conduct, and at the time of your death,
Yeah.
a lot of things will be brought to your attention at that time.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility of this?
That is said to be very possible. If one has practiced diligently during the course of one's life, but one hasn't had any achievement or any breakthrough. But often as death approaches, when the time of death arrives, it becomes a very intense experience. And so somebody who has practiced diligently, then their faculties sort of rise up at the time of death, and if they can maintain clear awareness, then they could apply their faculties and then reach some breakthrough.
So at that time, things will become more clear because you don't have the fetters of the physical body anymore. You're more just mind, and you can see things more clearly.
Well, before death actually takes place, of course, the physical body is still there. And so sometimes it could be that the pain of the body might just overwhelm the mind so that one can't really focus very well. But if one has trained oneself, then one could direct one's attention in the appropriate way before death takes place, and then reach some attainment even just seconds before death, or even a split second before death actually takes place.
And doing Buddha meditation, the Buddha, that's also what you can do too. Also, you can maintain that attainment until then. Yeah.
Well, the recitation of Amitabha Buddha is not supposed to lead to stream entry, but to rebirth in the Pure Land. So I would assume that if one can maintain the focus of the mind on Amitabha Buddha, it can lead to rebirth in the Pure Land.
I think you mentioned last time that for one who is practicing on the path to entry, realize non-self through the contemplation of three characteristics of existence. How is that understanding of non-self different from the removal of satiety?
What I would think is that the understanding of non-self that comes through the development of insight is still a temporary insight into non-self. One is examining and seeing the phenomena that arise as being non-self. So each phenomena that one turns to, that one directs the attention to, one sees this is non-self. The next one, this is non-self, this is not self, this is not self. But it's when one makes the breakthrough to the experience of stream entry that one sees into the heart of the Dhamma, the essential principle of the Dhamma, and with that the view of self gets completely obliterated, just cut off at the root. So with that one comes to the understanding that all Dhammas, all phenomena are non-self. On the stage of insight, one can't yet say sabbe dhamma anatta. All phenomena are non-self. But what one is saying that any phenomena that arises, one is seeing as non-self. Okay. I want to... Okay. Yeah, okay, if it's clear.
Is everything non-self, including the consciousness?
Yeah, consciousness too, non-self. Everything non-self.
turn it on.
So is this like with a self-realization that you reach a certain stage, or how do you know that there are any different stages? I mean, I know definitely how that is because the self is a big one in itself.
Yeah, there come very powerful experiences. The problem is that one can misinterpret one's experience and take it to be an attainment which it is not in actuality. And so one way would be to discuss the experience with somebody that one thinks might have actually reached the realization, and also keeping check upon oneself. But it's very easy to deceive oneself about the two lower stages, stream entry and once returning, because one could think, well, since I've learned Buddhism, so I don't hold any view of self. And somebody who has very strong faith, they think I don't have any doubt, and I don't undertake any of these ascetic practices, and cling to any of these rules and rituals, whatever. So I'm free from clinging to rules and rituals. So I'm a stream enterer. So one could be deceived about that. But when it comes to the third level, if sensual desire arises in the mind, or anger and ill will arise, then one could know definitely that one isn't a non-returner. But the problem again is sometimes people deceive themselves about their own emotional states. Okay, I'm just going to take the one question that came over the internet, and then I want to move on. Okay, two questions here. Okay, can we infer from the Buddha's life that he was already a once-returner prior to his last life on earth, or at least a stream enterer? He could not be a non-returner because as a non-returner he would not have had another rebirth on this earth, and he wouldn't have been able to have sexual relations and beget a son, which he did. Actually, nothing is said in the text about the Buddha having been either a stream enterer or a once returner before he came into the human world in his last life. And interestingly, even with respect to the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment, it's not said that he went through the stages of stream entry, once returning, non-returning, and arhatship. It's presented just as if he reached the stage of arhatship entirely through one sitting. So the commentaries will say that as he sat there meditating, he went through these stages: stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arhatship in quick succession. But the texts themselves, the sutta texts, don't speak about any differentiation of stages, even in that that final sitting, not to speak of him being either a stream enterer or once returner when he took rebirth in this world. Okay, then the second question: can we say that any practice not leading to Nibana, that is outside the Noble Eightfold Path, is silabbata paramasa, that's the clinging to rules and observances? I don't think one could say that any practice not leading to Nibana is clinging to rules and observances. There might be, for example, people do meritorious practices in order to gain merit with the idea of having a happy rebirth. For example, in Sri Lanka, people do what they call the Bodhi Puja. That's the devotion to the Bodhi tree. They do this because the Bodhi tree is the tree under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment, so it's a way of showing respect to the Buddha by respecting the tree under which he achieved enlightenment. It doesn't mean they believe the tree has magic powers, though some do. But if they say worship the Bodhi tree, worship Buddha images, doing this for the purpose of gaining merit, it's not actually part of the practice leading to Nibana, but I wouldn't say that this is Sila Bhatta Paramasa. And also say even non-Buddhist practitioners, say a Hindu yogi who practices meditation based on the view of Hinduism, the view of Brahman and Atman, that would be not practice leading to Nibbana, but I wouldn't say that this is clinging to Sila Bhatta, clinging to rules and observances. That's my opinion. Okay, I want to go on to the next passage in the text. I was surprised nobody asked the question I was expecting to get after we went through this previous paragraph. Because this paragraph is describing those who achieve the 4 levels. It is always using the word those monks. I expected somebody to raise a hand and say, at least, can't nuns achieve those stages? Or can lay people achieve those stages? And in fact, they can. This sutta that we just went through is the Buddha speaking to monks, and so he phrases it in terms of monks, because that was his audience. But here we have the next selection will show us who attains and what they attain. Here the Buddha is in a conversation with a wandering ascetic whose name is Vajjagota. Okay, so Vajjagota was a wanderer who often came to speak to the Buddha. And later he became a Buddhist monk and achieved arhathood himself. Okay, so now the Buddha says, he's describing the arhat. When a monk has abandoned craving, cut it off at the root, made it like a palm stump, done away with it so that it is no longer subject to future arising, then that monk is an arhat and so on, one who is completely liberated through final knowledge. Okay, now Vajjagota asks, apart from Master Gautama, the Buddha, is there any monk, your disciple, who by realizing it for himself with direct knowledge has entered upon and dwells in the liberation of mind, the liberation by wisdom that is taintless with the destruction of the taint? In other words, he's asking whether there is any other monk who is an arhat. Then the Buddha says, there are, Vajja, not only 100 or 2, 3, 4, or 500, but far more monks, my disciples, who have realized liberation by mind, liberation by wisdom, through the destruction of the taints, the asadas. Okay, then comes another question. Apart from Master Gautama and the monks, is there any nun, this is any bhikkhuni, Master Gautama's disciple, who by realizing it for herself with direct knowledge has achieved the liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom? And then the Buddha says in the same way, there's not only 100 or 500, but far more nuns, my disciples, who have realized this liberation. Okay, it seems to me that in a way the compilers of the Discourses have put the questions in Vajjagota's mouth in order to satisfy certain doctrinal requirements. Because Vajjagota doesn't ask, are there any householders who have achieved liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom? But in his next question, he says, apart from Master Gotama, that's apart from the Buddha, apart from the monks and nuns, is there any male lay follower, that's Upasaka, your disciple, clothed in white, leading a life of celibacy, who with the destruction of the 5 lower fetters will be reborn spontaneously in the pure abodes, and there attain final Nibana without ever returning from that world. In other words, he's asking whether there are any male lay followers who have become non-returners. Then the Buddha says there's not only 100 or 500, but far more male lay followers of mine, wearing white, leading lives of celibacy, who have achieved the stage of non-returner. Okay, then comes the same question in terms of, no, not the same. Okay, it's taking the male lay followers first. Apart from Master Gotama, the monks and nuns, and the male lay followers clothed in white, leading lives of celibacy, is there any male lay follower, Master Gotama's disciple, clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures, who carries out his instructions, responds to his advice, who has gone beyond doubt, become free from perplexity, gained intrepidity or confidence, and become independent of others in the teachers, the Buddha's dispensation. Then the Buddha says there are not only 100 or 500, but far more male followers, my disciples, clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures, who carry out my instruction, respond to my advice, have gone beyond doubt and so on, and have become independent of others in my dispensation. Then he asks, apart from Master Gotama, the monks and nuns, and the male lay followers, and so on, is there any female lay follower, your disciple, clothed in white, leading a life of celibacy, who with the destruction of the 5 lower fetters will be reborn spontaneously in the pure abodes and there attain final Nibana without ever returning from that world? In other words, is there any female lay follower leading a life of celibacy who has become a non-returner? Then the Buddha says there's not only 100 or 500, but far more female lay followers leading the lives of celibacy who have become non-returners. Then he asks, apart from Master Gotama and so on and so on and so on, is there any female lay follower, your disciple, clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures, who carries out your instructions, responds to your advice, who has gone beyond doubt, become free from perplexity, gained confidence, and become independent of others in your dispensation? Then the Buddha says there's not only 100 or 500, but far more female lay followers, clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures, who carry out my instructions, and so forth. Okay, so maybe this needs some explanation. Okay, the first 2 cases that we covered, for the first 2 questions, asked about monks and nuns, and asked whether they've achieved arhatship. And the Buddha confirms that there are many monks and nuns who have achieved arhatship. Okay, then the next question is asking about whether there's any male disciple, and from the description, who will be reborn spontaneously and attain final Nibana there without ever returning from that world. We know this is the non-returner. And we see that the question is asked only about lay followers who are leading a life of celibacy. This is because the non-returner cuts off the fetter of sensual desire. And so the non-returner naturally and normally, necessarily observes celibacy. And the same question also, and the same answer will apply to the question about the female lay disciple, clothed in white, leading a life of celibacy, who has achieved the state of a non-returner. And so since the non-returner necessarily observes celibacy, it seems to me that one who is a once-returner but is practicing diligently in order to achieve the state of a non-returner will naturally observe celibacy. It seems to me that that will become a necessary practice for making the transition to the state of a non-returner. Okay, now we come to the next question. This is in paragraph 10. He's asking whether there are any male lay followers clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures. Now this criterion, it's not as stringent and demanding as that for the state of non-return. And so the question is asking about those who carry out the Buddha's instructions, respond to his advice. It seems that could apply to any diligent disciple. But then comes the key expression, several key expressions. One who has gone beyond doubt and become free from perplexity. This implies that one is at least a stream enterer or a once-returner, because they are free from doubt. Perplexity is just a synonym for doubt. They've become confident and they're independent of others in the Buddha's teaching. That is, one who becomes a stream enterer gains the vision of the Dhamma, the eye of the Dhamma, so that they see the truth, and when they see the truth, they gain the Noble Eightfold Path, and they're carried along by the Noble Eightfold Path. So they're not even dependent on the Buddha anymore. They're independent of the Buddha in their practice, because they've gotten the necessary knowledge. They can ask the Buddha for instructions on how to practice, just to get some guidance and maybe the practice of meditation. But to understand the Dhamma, they don't depend on the Buddha anymore, but they have the essential insight or vision. Okay, so we notice that those who are described thus, we could understand these as stream enterers, once-returners. If they are lay disciples, they're not obliged to observe celibacy, but they can live within the framework of the 5 precepts, following the 3rd precept to abstain from sexual misconduct, from any kind of illicit or inappropriate sexual behavior. But even these disciples who are not observing celibacy can still be at the level of stream enterer or once-returner. Then, what he goes through, when he hears all of this, he goes through a long passage, which I won't read, I just summarize, but he says that if the Buddha's teaching contains only disciples, monk disciples who are arhats, but not nun disciples who are arhats, the teaching would be defective in that respect. But because the Buddha's teaching has both monks and nuns who are arhats, then it is complete in that respect. Then he goes on through each of the classes and says if the teaching was lacking that particular class, it would be defective, but because it has that class of disciple, it's complete in that respect. And then at the end, paragraph 14, he says, just as the river Ganges inclines towards the sea, slopes towards the sea, flows towards the sea, and reaches the sea, so too Master Gotama's assembly every Saturday I come to the climax of my lecture. Okay. Just as the river Ganges inclines towards the sea, slopes towards the sea, flows towards the sea, and reaches the sea, so too Master Gotama's assembly with its homeless ones and its householders inclines towards Nibana, slopes towards Nibana, flows towards Nibana, and reaches Nibana. Okay, we will stop here for today, and we'll have the class again next week. If there's any questions, we can take a few questions now, and then save the rest for after the lunch period. Any questions? Okay.
Okay, what would happen to a Buddhist practitioner if he observes celibacy but still enjoys other sensual pleasures? Will he be able to accomplish as a non-returner?
I don't think that would be an obstacle. I think when they speak about sensual pleasures here, they're really referring to sexual pleasures. That's my understanding. But maybe if somebody was, I don't know, if there's somebody, say, intensely interested in food, that they're always craving for different tastes and trying to enjoy different flavors, I think that would be an obstacle to their progress. I don't know whether that be others. If somebody has enjoyment of high quality music, I don't know whether that would be an obstacle. Okay, we will end by the sharing of the merits, and then we'll have discussion period at 12 o'clock. Akasata Sabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyanta Anumoditva Sirang Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Sabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyanta Anumoditva Sirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Sabhumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyanta Anumoditva Sirang Rakantu Manparam Etavatasya Amhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatasya Amhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatasya Amhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavarupadhaya Vijayatato Etantare Satakaya Prapanna Rupiya Rupita Sanya Sanino Dukkha Pamusantu Pusantu